Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I have been waiting to make this video for a really long time. I love watching these so much. I think it sometimes gives you like a good idea of a person's reading tastes, but it's also very complicated because the more you read, the more likely you are to add to that list, and sometimes you can't really encompass all of the things. So I thought I would kind of lay down some definitions before I actually get into the list, because it just used to be a lot easier in like high school, but now it's gotten to the point where I have books kind of set up in categories in my head, librarian. It's good to kind of know what I'm not including. So I made a list. I am not including poetry, and this includes foundational texts like the Odyssey, and this also includes Shakespeare. If we were going to include Shakespeare, I think we'd be here all day. I mean, Hamlet obviously is one of the greatest plays of all time. I had the biggest crush on Richard III, and there's just so much to discuss in Shakespeare. So I'm going to leave him out of it as well, and obviously the rest of poetry. But then science fiction, fantasy, and graphic novels deserves its own video. And I'm also not including fairy tales and folklore, including apocryphal tales from Bible or things like the Kalevala. And then the last thing I'm not including is series. So for example, something like Sherlock Holmes will not be included. I absolutely love Sherlock Holmes, but it's just such a long series. Character development happened over such a long period of time that it's kind of unfair to include it in this list. Another thing I'm going to mention is that I like these books for their individual merit as a singular text. I don't necessarily care about what the author did or what other works they wrote. So just because I like this one text by them, it doesn't necessarily mean that I like any of their other stuff. So these are my favorite books of all time as of 2018. They are obviously subject to change, and I hope that they do change because that means I'm reading great things. I'll just stop rambling and get into it. So the very first book is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This book is absolutely wonderful and it's so creative. Got this edition from Subterranean Press and it's signed by her. I don't know if you could see the cover with the sort of caravans. This book imagines a sort of dystopian future where everything's gone, like internet, technology, everything just sort of stops and vanishes. But it focuses more on sort of the human interactions and what people will continue to be doing. And St. John Mandel imagines that in the future people would still be performing Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is that one common friend we all have that brings us all together. And it follows a kind of guild of actors, and the characters are just so memorable. It's just such a wonderful book. I just love the take on it, and I thought it was so creative, but it's also got the most beautiful language I've ever seen. Patient, and it takes its time, and it's just so wonderful. And I read this on a train, which kind of added to the sort of wonderful atmosphere of it. So this is my number 10. Coming in at number 9 is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. Even broke this freaking spine. I read this book twice now, but the first time it took me really long. It was one of my first reads that kind of tipped me over into the side of I'm a reader now. And I read this at my grandparents' house in Romania, in this like beautiful village. And it was just such a great reading experience altogether. Obviously, you probably know the plot of Anna Karenina, but if you don't, it follows Anna Karenina, who is a married woman with a child, who comes to visit her brother as he's having some marital problems. She is soon spotted by this man named Vronsky, and he has this big crush on her, and his mission becomes to try to marry her or to seduce her. And, you know, I'm not going to say much more because, I mean, obviously the plot is rather long, and it is about a married woman's affair mainly, and there's a subplot following a bunch of sort of peasants dealing with class struggles, and there are subplots throughout with various relationships. But what it's ultimately about, it's the societal pressure specifically on women when it comes to certain dynamics, and how those same dynamics don't seem to affect men at all. And I consider this to be one of the most feminist texts of all times. And it was, you know, written by a man, a wealthy man, an influential man. How it happens is what's interesting in this book, and how Tolstoy manages to make characters come together at the right time. I find that Anna's brother kind of acts like this social glue, keeping all of these characters of various classes together. I admire this book stylistically, I think is what I'm trying to say, and I admire what Tolstoy tried to do at a time where not a lot of men would have thought to do something like this. And there's a lot more to discuss, of course, once you know the ending. For me, this was just a wonderful reading experience, and it stays with me. And I think one of the reasons it's on this list, it's because it's so mesmerizing and it stays with you. Like, there are many times you'll go through things or read other books and this will come back in your mind because it's so important. And I think once you kind of put so much time into something, you kind of become attached to it because you've spent so much time in it. Number 7 is a play. It is Rabbit Hole by David Lindsay-Abaire. This book won the Pulitzer Prize and got its own movie adaptation with Nicole Kidman. Now, I didn't particularly care that much for the adaptation, but this play is absolutely amazing. What I loved about this play was how much the author or the playwright was able to convey through so little dialogue. So this is how the dialogue looks like most of the time, just kind of one sentence things. And what it accomplishes at the end, and when you start discussing it and thinking about it, it's kind of incredible that he's managed to do it in such few words. So this story follows a couple, Becca and Howie, and they've lost their son Danny, and their son was 4 years old and got hit a drunk driver who was 17 or 16 years old. And the main couple kind of is broken by this experience, but they're both dealing with it in very different ways. While Becca is trying to pretend like none of it happened and to erase all memories of Danny because dealing with it is just too difficult for her. Howie wants to celebrate his life. He kind of builds up a shrine and constantly brings Danny into conversation. He tries to say, he lived and we have to celebrate that. And it's just such an interesting take on grief and how different people cope with it differently, but also the effect it has at large on more than just the two people affected. So family members, the way they interact with them, seeing other people with children in their life and other people sort of tippy-toeing around them. I think where this also takes a very interesting turn is that the person who killed Danny in the first place sort of tries to make amends with the parents, and he becomes friends with the mom. And he's really into multiple universes because he likes to imagine a universe where he didn't do what he did. And he's also a kid in himself, and he can't really blame him. And it was just such a wonderful book. Again, like, nothing is really spoilery because the book is just so concentrated on just this one event and kind of holding up these characters and looking at the various ways in which they deal with this one event. And I really loved it. A lot. You can probably tell because I keep ranting about it. So okay, as I'm preparing to list number 6, I realize now that this is kind of a non-fiction book, and I said I wouldn't include non-fiction books, but I think this is usually thrown in the classics category with fiction usually, even though it's a non-fiction, so I do apologize for that. But it's Walden by Thoreau. This is what I like to consider my comfort classic. I like to return to this book often because it's very calm and it's escapist in a very realist way. So Walden is, Thoreau decided that he had it with society for a long time. Things are too expensive, it's ridiculous, and people care too much about, fashion and things that they shouldn't care about. So he packs up his bags, goes to this forest near Walden Pond in the United States, and he builds himself this really tiny house. And in this tiny house, he lives for about 2 years, and he kind of marks down all of his experiences, basically living off the grid before there was a grid. And it's kind of interesting because I think now he would be one of those people who would still do this, but it would be considered more extreme. And I'm surprised that at the time he did it was considered extreme. But it's something that I think makes me feel very calm, just because of all the descriptions of the forest and the animals, and just him being sort of fed up with it all. And kind of reading it makes me feel like I'm doing it every time. I don't want to bring gender studies into this, but I've always thought that Emily Dickinson would have loved to do something like this. And I think if she had the freedoms to do so, like a bachelor male would, she would have done it. And I always like to think, what would it mean if a woman had done that at the time versus Thoreau? And I don't know, it just sparks a lot of thoughts. So I love this book very much. I do have the annotated version of this as well, so maybe I could just show you a replica that someone's made of the cabin that Thoreau kind of built for himself. So that's what it would look like. It was very tiny, and he had very few things, and he lists what he brought with him. Coming in at number 5 is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. I took an entire course on Nabokov, so I read all of his works, and this is one of those books that's kind of like in the context. I think read out of context, Lolita can seem very creepy in many ways, and in a weird way it sort of started like Lolita fashion and so many other Lolita references that were very sexualized inappropriately in the wrong context and then associated with this text. When our professor was introducing this text to us, he told us that Nabokov's intention was to present to the world a book where adults have failed a child miserably, and he succeeded. This book follows Humbert, who is this very creepy older male from Europe who comes to America, and he has this weird fetish for very young women between the ages of 10 and 14. He calls them nymphets. And they're not yet teenagers, so they're not fully developed, but they're not really just full-on children either. They're somewhere in between. And he likes their innocence, and he always tries to justify why he does the things he does. There are references to Edgar Allan Poe's Annabel Lee, and there's a lot of jabbing or jokes throughout where you get the sense that Nabokov really hates Freud and his Freudian analysis of childhood. And Humbert always tries to justify the things he does by saying, oh, well, you know, this thing happened to me in childhood and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And the first half of the book brings you to this one very particular point. And the truth is that a lot of people stop reading after that point. And the second half is generally known to be a more boring half. But that half is where Nabokov tries to redeem not only himself as an author, but he tries to redeem the plot, where he shows you the downfall of this character named Lolita and what happens after she is pretty much abused by an older male. And in a weird way, Nabokov sort of like wags his finger at you for saying, you know, you wanted this very explicit scene and you didn't get it, and then you're bored. And it's very judgmental and elitist in many ways, and there are many reasons why this book is so impressive. I think one of the main ones is that Nabokov wrote this in his second language, and he uses words here that are very complex. And I think I'm going to talk about this again in a separate video, because there's so much to say about this and what it sparked. And I think what it ultimately sparked is what's interesting, and the conversations it began, and just the ways others have tried to imitate Humbert's voice, which is very lyrical and enchanting and seducing. And he's succeeding. He's seducing you, the reader, and many times you sort of forget who he's talking about, and you kind of root for him, and you find yourself in this very dark pit wondering, how did you get here in the first place? It's great storytelling and great craftsmanship. And I will add that Nabokov's wife helped him a lot with this, and she helped him find complex words to incorporate in this text, and she saved Lolita from the fire. He was going to throw it away many times, and she saved the manuscript saying, no, you need to do this, it's important. Coming in at number 5 is Ocean Sea by Alessandro Baricco. This is an Italian writer, and he writes in the most poetic way possible. His words are kind of like taking a bath in cuddles. It's just so beautiful and poetic in every way. But the plot follows a group of people who arrive at this inn by the ocean, and they are all there to heal. But they're all there to heal different things. So there's a person with terminal cancer, there's a person trying to mend a broken heart, there's a woman getting over a divorce, there's a man trying to find his soulmate. Just all of these various ways that people try to heal. And they all come together at this inn. Their paths sort of cross, and they do interact with each other, but we kind of followed their stories independently of each other. But the language and the way they sort of interact with the ocean and its healing properties is what makes this book extraordinary. I think my favorite one in this is the painter who's trying to paint the ocean but doesn't know where to begin, because he usually starts with the eyes because he does portraits, but the ocean has no eyes. And then his struggle to kind of be an artist and paint the ocean takes over the plot, and it's just so beautiful. I don't know, I think I said the word beautiful a million times when it comes to this, but it really is its charm, and it's why I love it so very much. I mean, at number 4 is my absolute favorite children's book, and that's Peter Pan. I have a tattoo of Peter Pan on my back. It is the most important text to me in terms of analysis. It's absolutely charming. It deals with so many aspects of childhood and growth and dealing with inner struggles. I really enjoyed Jen Campbell's video on Peter Pan. I thought she explained it really well, where some interpretations of Peter Pan include Wendy sort of dealing with her own changes in this imaginary space aside from her home, where she is in a way Peter as well. And a very literal depiction of this was done in a retelling by Austin Chant, and it's a trans narrative of Peter Pan called Peter Darling. I really enjoyed this as well, but just Peter Pan in general is just so wonderful. It follows Wendy Darling and her brothers who are taken away to Neverland by Peter. Obviously, this is a very famous story. I'm probably not going to summarize it for you, but I think what I love about it is that it has, you know, pirates and adventure, but it also has so much depth to kind of growing into an adult or changing, or the fears we have of leaving things behind. And it deals with these themes so well. And I mean, it's just, there are no words. Coming in at number 3 is one of the most polarizing and divisive books on Booktube, particularly when it comes to classics, and that's Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I like this copy because it has these sort of character drawings that I really enjoy. I got the annotated version as well because it feels like sort of a lecture as you're reading, explaining certain aspects of it. I will do a full video in the future called In Defense of Heathcliff. I've already titled it. And for me, this story is a love story, very much. However, it is a love story between two very broken people. And they've been broken down by society and its expectations and the way that they were raised, that by adulthood, there's just so much brokenness that they both really just deserve to be in therapy forever. But they are dealing with what they had, and they do love each other very much. They just don't really know how to deal with it and how to take it from the mistakes that they've made up to a point. And I think for that, it's something that I really love in literature, where you're very conflicted inside because you feel like there's so much wrong and there's so much broken in the characters, but you still really kind of care about them and you're rooting for them in some way. And that's what I found sort of appealing to Wuthering Heights, and it's definitely one of my favorite classics. It's number 3. But I also really love Emily's atmosphere, and I think that this is what sets this apart from other things like Pride and Prejudice or Jane Eyre, is that it takes you to this very dark sort of gothic landscape. You know, you have the dark moors, the thunderstorms, the ghostly appearances, the sort of graves, and I mean, if you have watched this channel for even a little bit, you'll know that that's something that I'm very much into. So this atmosphere is very much this vivid presence in the story that is very hard to divorce from the love narrative. I will discuss this further in the future, but Wuthering Heights is number 3 for me. My second favorite novel up to this point is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It is tough to say which Dostoevsky book is favorite. I love this one the most, and I'll explain why. But The House of the Dead is probably the most depressing thing I've ever read, and I loved it. And Poor Folk is one of my favorite novellas of all time, and it's an epistolary novel, and it's one of Dostoevsky's earlier works, which I absolutely love. Also, Bobok is one of my favorite short stories by Dostoevsky, but this book in particular, I think, for me, is kind of this highlight of what sets Dostoevsky apart from Tolstoy. Someone like Tolstoy and Shakespeare always present stories about the elite. They have kings and queens, dukes and duchesses, people who are so high up on this social ladder pedestal. It's very hard to sort of ever relate to them, but they're untouchable. And in a weird way, that's what makes those stories so unique, because no one can say anything to them. It's like, well, you don't know. You're not Prince of Denmark. And what Dostoevsky does is he takes all of these beautiful narratives, but he applies them to the like main people, the peasants, the poor folk. And for me, coming from Eastern Europe and from a very tiny, rural, pastoral farming town, this book kind of speaks to that. It takes a family of a father and 3 sons, and even though one of them is super religious and a monk basically who leaves the monastery, and one of them is super intelligent, they're all very much simple people in a simple town. And the superstition, the Orthodox Christianity, the simpleness of the plot, but also the sort of dynamics between the characters and the conversations that they have, are all just representative of everything I hold dear to my heart. And I think for me, like, this again played so much into just where I come from personally, that it's had such a huge impact on me. The small town feel, the simplicity, the dialogues, the theological discussions, just everything about this was just so perfect. I love it. So my number 1 favorite novel, you probably already know this if you followed me for a little bit because I've mentioned it before. It's The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse. This novel is my absolute favorite novel of all time. This follows a character by the name of Joseph. He is a very good student, and it's sort of set in the distant future, but it's science fiction, and in a weird way it's not. It's very much reflective of Buddhist and monastic kind of settings. And the students at this school, Castilia, are extremely talented. They are so knowledgeable in all things, but part of their education also includes meditation and this sort of Eastern influence. The combination of this elitist Western academic setting with Buddhist philosophy and spirituality, but done so well in novel format while at the same time working on character development, I think was so successful the way that Hesse did this. And he wrote this book just before winning the Nobel Prize in Literature, at a time where the world was in absolute chaos. And just everything about this book and its circumstances makes this such a wonderful, wonderful book. I so wish that I could read this in German. I think that would be like an absolute goal of mine in life, to just be able to read in German, just so I can read this book and Rilke's poetry, and then my life would be complete. That's my top 10 favorite books as of right now. I would love to know if any of these books are books that you've read and loved, and where you stand on some of these. I know that some of them are divisive, and I am sorry if you've had bad experiences with these, or if you were forced to read them in high school at any point, or forced to read them in a context where you didn't want to, because I think that aspect alone ruins a lot of books for people. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.